lovely stuff. Rod Stewart, of course, and Handbags and Glam Rags. And I was just having a little chat to Derek, who's obviously come back in again, and we're just discussing which was the best version. And there's 4 main versions that we can come up with. Chris Farlow, Mike Darbo's original, the Stereophonics, obviously, and Rod's. Derek, let's bring Derek in. Derek, there you go, mate.
Hi, Dave. Great to be back with you again, mate. Yeah. Chris Farlow.
Lovely to see. I was going to say, lovely to see. I haven't seen you since Sunday.
That's right. And that was a very pleasant day.
It was a lovely day. It was a lovely day. Chris Farlow's got to Derek's vote. Rod's gone to me. Is my vote. The Stereophonics to me is just like a carbon copy of Rod's version.
It's almost a tribute band version of it.
Yeah, but it's a good version.
It's very good. Nothing wrong with it. But
there's nothing actually brought into it. But to me, the worst is Mike Darbo's version. His singing on it is just. Yeah. But to me, it just, oh, gosh, you just want to know.
Which is strange, because, I mean, he took over from Paul Jones, didn't he?
He did,
Manfred Mann.
But he just didn't do it. But for me, anyway. But so it's Rod for me and Chris Farlow for Derek. And we started off with a bit of Louis Jordan and Caledonia. The reason I played that was... I was down the gym the other day, and I was on the treadmill, and I've got this. It's one of these treadmills that's got like built-in speakers on the as I'm going to say, on the dashboard. I suppose it is like the dashboard. It's got all the where the numbers come up and all that kind of thing. It's got built-in speakers, and I'm running away, and I noticed that the beat of Caledonia was exactly 8 kilometres an hour. It is. As you're running, your feet touch every single time on 8 kilometres an hour. Yeah. So I thought, I wonder how many others are like that. and you wouldn't believe that you wouldn't believe it, but there are quite a few songs that run at 8 kilometres an hour. So the next time you're out running and you've got your earphones in and you obviously can't see what's in front, you don't exactly know how fast you're running. But if you've gone out for a run, if you think that what you're running to is exactly the same time as the pace you're running at, there's a good chance it'll be 8 kilometres an hour.
There's got to be a compilation CD there, hasn't there? Yeah, Runner's Guide.
The Runner's Guide, all at 8 kilometres an hour, which is, what's that, about, I don't know, 5.5 miles an hour? Is it something like that, 6 miles an hour?
On the A side, you could have 8, and on the B side, you could have 12, of course, for people who really want to get stuck into it.
Really want to get going, don't they?
Yeah.
But there you go. Caledonia, Louis Jordan, of course, and 8 kilometres an hour. This is me, Dave Roberts, on this side of the desk on 107 Meridian FM. And in case you're wondering, it's that time again. That's that time again of the month when Mr. Derek Shelmerdine joins me for the first about 45 minutes of the show. And we do a subject. If you've never joined us before, we just do a subject, a musical subject. We've done, oh gosh, I mean, you've been doing this for what, about 18 months now?
Oh, no, 3 years nearly.
Is it really?
Yeah, we're up to about 30 or 32, I think.
Gosh, wow.
It's amazing.
Time fly. Okay,
and we've only had 1 2-parter.
Yes.
Atlantic Records.
The second hour you've only been doing that for just over a year, haven't you?
Yeah, just over a year.
Yeah,
that was about 18 months.
That's what I was thinking of. We do a subject, and tonight's subject happens to be the British folk rock music scene.
Yeah, I mean it's a really fascinating area, and like a lot of these genres, it's got really quite a clear start and really quite a clear end. But we'll come to the end sort of later on, I think.
At the end.
Towards the latter part. But really, I mean, the whole folk rock thing, as you'd imagine, grew out of the post-war folk revival. But what's interesting is it was on both sides of the Atlantic, the folk revival. In America in the 40s and 50s, you had people like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly. And they were in bands like the Almanac Singers and the Weavers. Now they were all very, as the folk scene over here was in the 50s, very left wing. They sang songs of solidarity and supported the unions,
workers' rights and all that stuff.
Absolutely, and they were all blacklisted as communists because that was the Joe McCarthy era. When America was very, very concerned about the communist threat. Because you've got to remember that this is the Cold War. This is immediately after World War II. And the threat of, a nuclear annihilation of the world was a very, very real threat in the 50s and 60s. And America took the view that anybody who was a communist was somebody who was not a good person. And they had the Un-American Activities Committee. And people like Pete Seeger were actually prevented. Well, he was actually imprisoned, and he was prevented from appearing on TV. And what happened in the mid-'60s was that people like Bob Dylan, or Bob Dylan in particular, he'd come to the fore in the early 60s as a folk singer, folk protest singer, and very much a fan of Woody Guthrie. And in March 65, he released his first album to include electric songs. He had one, Bring It All Back Home, and he had one side electric and one side acoustic. Now, around this same sort of time, the Byrds, on April the 12th, 65, in America, they released Mr. Tambourine Man. Now, Mr. Tambourine Man was from that album, but it was from the acoustic side, but the Byrds decided they'd do an electric version of it. And they followed it up with several other electric versions of Bob Dylan's songs. And Dylan himself played his notorious electric set at the Newport Festival, and that was July 1965. So you can see very much that folk was turning into folk rock in America, certainly, around the 1965 period. Now, if we look at the UK, in 1953, the Ballads and Blues Club opened in London at the Princess Louise pub in High Holborn. And one of the co-founders was Ewan McCall, who was very much to the fore of the British post-war folk revival movement. He too was left-wing, very much a left-wing activist. But we didn't have a Joe McCarthy to give the same sort of impact. And to put the music into context, in the mid-50s, we're looking at skiffle growing out of trad jazz. And the real landmark is the 13th of July 54, when Chris Barber released his New Orleans Joys album. And that actually contained Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line. They got released as a single a couple of years later. So that was very much when skiffle then morphed into rock and roll, morphed into beat groups in the UK, and via the British invasion, by the time you get to the mid-60s, rock music is starting to take a hold. And as we talked in various other genres, things like prog rock started around this sort of time, the mid-60s, where prog rock was very much looking to emulate the experience of mind-bending drugs. Folk rock didn't quite look to do that. But what was happening was that British folk artists who'd been playing the folk clubs in the 50s and 60s, they started to embrace electric instruments, and instruments that really weren't so associated with folk music. And you can see very much by you get to say mid-66, you've got the Incredible Band's first album. Now that was folk-ish. I mean, that wasn't an electric album, but they were very much down the sort of psychedelic folk route. If you listen to them, it's sort of folkish folk music, but it's very much akin to the kind of music that was psychedelic music that was being played, particularly British psychedelic. Because that was much more whimsical and lent itself much more to a sort of an amalgamation with folk. And that was on the Elektra label. The other interesting thing is that these people we talk about across this are all on labels like Elektra, Island and Harvest, and the more, not technically indie labels necessarily, but certainly the more esoteric labels, which I thought was quite interesting when I started.
Obviously, the bigger ones, they weren't prepared to take the risk then.
That's right, and they just didn't play that kind of music. But it's interesting, really. And Incredible String Band was very much Mike Heron. Well, the first one was a trio, Robin Williamson and Clive Palmer, and produced by Joe Boyd. Now, Joe Boyd's interesting. He worked for Elektra, and he was the one that got them into the first gig they did outside of London at the Albert Hall. Can you imagine? Outside Scotland, rather. The first gig that you play outside of Scotland is at London's Royal Albert Hall. Absolutely awesome. And that was because basically the other acts on there were Elektra acts. Tom Paxton was one of them. They played that. They played that on November the 4th, 66. So by the time you get to the beginning of 1967, I mean, they released their second album, which has got one of the great album titles, I think, 5,000 Layers or Layers of the Onion. I mean, that could only be a sort of folky, weirdy kind of album, couldn't it? You just know that's worth listening to.
It sounds like a good onion to me. I like an onion.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I love like a good onion.
Well fried.
Oh.
Well fried.
Caramelised.
Oh, yes.
Whatever that means. I think that involves sugar, but I'm not altogether sure. I'm not famed for my cookery skills.
Any cooks out there, please let us know.
Yes, exactly. When is a caramelised, not a caramelised? Yeah. Exactly. Yes, it's really, I think, certainly in the UK, British folk rock, 67's where it all sort of kicks off. Because you got bands like Pentangle, they were sort of coming together early 67. People like Byrds and John Renburn, now they were big folk acts on the circuit there, and Jackie McShee as well. And then they formed Pentangle with a rhythm section, so various people, but folk people with a bass guitarist and a drummer. I always remember they did that great. I don't know if you remember. It was a show on BBC One, like I don't know what you'd call it. It wasn't like, not a comedy show, but it was called Take Three Girls. Do you remember that? Oh, I do actually. And they did the theme tune to it. Oh, I'm trying to think what it was called now. Perhaps it was called Take Three Girls. I can't remember now, but it was gorgeous bit of music. Yeah, good old Bert. It's a really interesting. It wasn't very commercially successful. As we're going through, we'll look at some of these bands. Not many actually had hit singles, but not many. You'd think bands that they've been going a long time. Had one hit single. I just remembered. I think it was called Take Flight. Oh, right. I don't know why it came to me. Sorry about that. Sorry to interrupt your flow there. On Spotify or any other good streaming service. And, I mean, these now are in no particular order. They're just bands and individuals that really started to pop up. I mean, they'd been around a while before this. But this is now, because we're into the beginning of the rock era, 66... 67, record companies are taking interest. Roy Harper released his first album, Sophisticated Beggar. I mean, it's a really nice album. I listened to it again while I was researching this. A really, really interesting album. And the Strawbs. I mean, they started out, another great name, the Gin Bottle 4. Now, if you see that in an open mic night or an advert for a pub, here Thursday evening at 9 o'clock, we've got the Gin Bottle 4. They're probably worth having to listen to. I mean, they became the Strawberry Hill Boys. Yeah. And then they became the Strawbs, obviously, Dave Cousins and all that lot. I mean, their first album, I remember, the Battle, the Blind Priest, Blessing Both Sides. Absolutely awesome. And Fairport Convention, I mean, they started off in mid-67. And interesting enough, they had a first gig at Church Hall. And imagine you're Sean Frater, who's on the drum stool. And this guy comes up to the band, probably presumably halfway through after the first set and before the second, and he says, "Hey, I can play better than him." Anyway, that was Martin Lamble, and Martin Lamble was on the drum stool for their second gig. So that was good. Although, sadly, life wasn't good for him. And Tyrannosaurus Rex is another one that, Mark Bolan had been beavering away for years, John's Children and solo projects, before finding success with Tyrannosaurus success. But that was limited success, I think, to be fair. I mean, John Peel pioneered him a lot. He was a big fan. But, I mean, he made his live debut at Middle-earth, September the 23rd. John Martin, his first album arrived around this time, late 67, London Conversation. And interestingly enough, Jethro Tull, they were forming towards the end of 67. They came from a band called the John Evan Band. And unlike the rest of them, who'd essentially sort of come from folk people who decided to move in a slightly more rock and roll direction, they were actually a blues outfit. And it was, the last lineup of the John Evan Band became Jethro Tull. But their first album, 68, was called This Was. And the reason it was called This Was is because it was a sort of bluesy, focused album. And what they were saying was, look, we're moving away from all this, which is perhaps why Mick Abrams, one of the founders and lead guitarist, he left shortly after the album to form Bloodwind Pig. Presumably he's got some kind of Welsh ancestry that would inspire the name, but that was good. I mean, there's an interesting quick short story with that. When they looked to replace Mick Abrams, Tony Iommi Earth at the time became Black Sabbath. He was with them very, very shortly, but just long enough to play the Rolling Stones' Rock'n'Roll Circus, which we have chatted about in the past. So that was interesting, because Rock'n'Roll Circus is now one of those cult programs for all kinds of reasons. And the ex-Nice guitarist David O'List, he had a very, very short stay with them as well, but they couldn't get on musically. And then basically Martin Barr came in, and he became the guitarist for a very long time to come. And Ralph Mctell, I mean, if you talk about British folk rock, I mean, the name Ralph Mctell has to pop in there. I mean, he was essentially a folk artist who embraced electric sounds, really. He didn't go off down the psych folk route or anything like that. But I thought it might be good to hear from one of these particular bands, and from their second album, this is the Incredible String Band's Painting Box.
Oh, that was lovely, wasn't it? The Incredible String Band there, and a track called Painting Box. I was just saying to Derek, actually, I think it's the first track by them I've ever heard.
Oh, great band.
You can't listen to everything, obviously went down a different road to this kind of thing, but it's lovely, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Jolly. Pleasant on the ears. Massages the ears nicely.
Absolutely.
Rolls them into shape.
Yeah. And they have great titles for the albums. One's called The Hangman's Beautiful Daughter. I mean, where do these titles come from? I mean, they are absolutely superb. But I thought that was a great example of sort of the roots, if you like, of folk rock, where you can see folk is going off in a much more heavier direction for some bands. And the late 60s is when a lot of other bands started to come to the fore. I mean, Lindisfarne from the northeast of England, they formed as Brethren. And classic route here, a bit like the Ballads and Blues Club, Ewan McCall. Now, Ewan McCall, I don't think anybody could ever say has moved into the folk rock direction. But the guy that used to run the Rex Hotel, or folk club, at the Rex Hotel in Whitley Bay, Alan Hull, he was one of the founding members of Lindisfarne. He went off and did some solo stuff as well. I remember I had an album of his called Pipe Dreams for a while. I mean, it's great stuff. I mean, they actually became Lindisfarne in about 1970, but we'll pick that story up a little bit later. Now, Pentangle had their first hit single in May the 16th, 69. So you can see that the now the very end of the 60s is when the folk rock is starting to find some commercial success. That was a track called Once I Had a Sweetheart, and it made number 46 for 1 week. I mean, it's the story of very few of these bands found any kind of commercial success. But what's interesting about that single, it was produced by Shel Talmy. Now, that's the guy, Decca, that was producing the Who stuff at the very beginning. So that's the same guy that produced My Generation and the like. So it's interesting to see people like Joe Boyd, Shel Talmy, they're very much getting involved in this, and it's producers like that that are really, I think, helping to mould the sound. And in fact, the next band is going to mention, Renaissance. They grew out of the Yardbirds. When the Yardbirds decided to call it a day, Keith Relf, the sort of singer harmonica guy, and Jim McCarty formed an acoustic duo called Together. They had a couple of hit singles, but nothing dramatic. And then they decided that what they do is extend the lineup somewhat, get a rhythm section in there, and formed Renaissance. And for the lead singer, they chose Jane Relf, who was Keith Relf's sister. Now, she'd never been in a band before, so a bit like playing at the Incredible String Band, playing at the Royal Albert Hall for the first time. I mean, she went straight into a First Division folk rock band, so that was pretty cool, really. And they released their first album the end of 1969, but they fell apart. They had a second album that I think was it was originally, I think, only ever released in Germany, which is interesting. And then Keith Relf quit sort of 1970. But 1972, a whole new band came together, essentially, and they called themselves, Renaissance picked itself up as it were, and they released an album called Prologue, which is it's an interesting kind of name for an album. But I think one of the cornerstones of folk rock just has to be Fairport Convention. I mean, by the time that you get to the beginning of 1969, they released their What We Did on Our Holidays album, and Sandy Denny, of course, is with Fairport Convention by now, and that's got tracks on it like Meat on the Ledge, which I always remember that was the track that got me into Fairport Convention at the time, because it was released on a sampler. That's on Island, and I forgot what the sampler was called now. I can't remember, but I remember Meet Me on the Ledge was on. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. We'll have some of that. But the other thing I notice about folk rock bands is that the members come and go with frightening frequency, and they always shoot off and form another band. It's probably music. Oh, I don't like the direction we're going there, because you've got to remember that this is from the sort of folk background. So all these people, or most of these guys, have been listening to folk, grown up on folk. So when they move into a sort of folk rock arena, they just find different directions they want to go in. And the reason I mention that was this is the first guy that left, Ian Matthews, in early '69. So shortly after What We Did in Our Holidays, which is a very rated album, he left and formed Matthews Southern Comfort. Now, he might have left so he could call the band after himself, which is always a very nice thing to do. I mean, it must be quite pleasant to see an album cover with your name as the band's name. But sadly, on May the 12th, '69, drummer Martin Lambert died. He was another guy that was killed the van crashed on the way back from a gig. And one of the ladies in the band, Jeannie Franklin, she was actually Phil Oakes' cousin. And she was a clothes designer known as Jeannie the Tailor, and she did a lot of work for Cream. So if you've ever wondered why Jack Bruce's Songs for a Tailor album is called Songs for a Tailor, the tailor in that is Jeannie the Tailor. And
what happened to her? Did she in the crash?
Yeah, she died.
She died as well.
Yeah,
Gosh.
She died as well. She was I forget which one now. She was one of the girlfriends.
All right.
But Phil Oakes' sister. I mean, because he, of course, is another folk artist, protest folk in America. One of my favourite, actually. And then middle of July, they're doing Unhalf Bricking, and Dave Swarbrick, who's a fiddle player, very, very well respected. And I think it's when you start to introduce electric fiddle into these bands, you get some fantastic sounds. He plays on some of those tracks, and of course that's Sandy Denny's still with them. And around that time, now my French is not all that good, so I dare say the pronunciation here is not 100% accurate to French-speaking French people, but it's called Si tu dois partir, or something like that. That's a fairly phonetic kind of pronunciation of it. What it actually means...
You've probably just offended most of France, you realise that?
Let's hope not, because it's actually a French adaptation of Bob Dylan's If You Gotta Go, Go Now.
Okay.
But they decided they'd sing it in French. But what I say about bands not being all that commercially successful, Fairport Convention is arguably, well, certainly one of the biggest bands to come out of that era, and they carried on. They're gigging to this day in various, with various members, and because they've had so many, it's relatively easy, I think, to get together a band with people who've played there before. That was their only UK hit single, and that only got to number 21. Absolutely incredible. And again, that was produced by Joe Boyd. So you've got these heavy-duty people very involved in all this. And then Dave Swarbrick and Dave Mattox joined. Mattox was to replace Martin Lambert. And something again now you probably wouldn't see too much of. On September the 24th, 1969, they were at the Royal Festival Hall in London, and they were premiering their fourth album. It wasn't released until the December, but they were actually out playing Legion Leaf. What's that? That's good 3 or 4 months. Now, I can recall the Pink Floyd were actually out on the road with Dark Side of the Moon literally a year before it was released. Absolutely unheard of now. Frank Zappa used to do that.
Yeah.
He used to tour playing, he used to do 3-hour sets. So he'd play some of his stuff that everybody knew, and then he'd spend an hour and a half playing stuff nobody'd ever heard before, because he was perfecting arrangements.
When I saw the Floyd doing Dark Side, they did a lot of tracks that, although not quite the same, in a kind of remorphed situation, ended up on Wish You Were Here. But they were totally different tracks that nobody had ever heard.
Yeah.
You know. But what was it called? The one I remember called "You Got to Be Crazy."
Oh, right.
But obviously ended up was "Shine On You Crazy Diamond" sort of thing. But it was a sort of interpretation of that that then moved on to what we all know now. Yeah. You know. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great idea. The trouble now, of course, it'd all be so heavily bootlegged.
Yeah, everyone would know it.
Allegedly.
Yeah.
But, that would have been a great place to have been. And that album was actually advertised as the first British folk rock album. And that's December 6th. So that's basically, 1970 is when you could say the British folk rock as British folk rock really started. And then again around that time, the very end of 1969, Ashley Hutchins left, and he formed Steel Eye Span. This is basically shortly after Legion Leaf, and Sandy Denny left and formed Fotheringay. I think there were 2 Fotheringay albums. I mean, she has got some superb things. And she, of course, appeared the only guest singer on any Led Zeppelin albums. Battle of Evermore on Zeppelin 4. So that's quite an accolade, I think. She died, sadly, in 1978. I think she fell down some stairs.
Yeah.
Not good. And Richard Thompson, who, of course, was one of I think that was who Jeannie the Taylor's boyfriend was, Richard Thompson. He left for a solo career in the early 1971. So, Legion Leaf was the album where the guys really decided to get into some serious folk, and they went back and delved into the old archives. And that album, I can't remember exactly, but has about 10 tracks, and 3 of them are new, and the others are all traditional, rearranged. And this particular one is actually one of the new ones, but it's very much in the style of folk. And this is on from Legion of Leaf, and this is "Come All Ye."
Oh, I was just saying to Derek, I haven't heard that for a while, and God, it goes, doesn't it?
Oh, it's brilliant. That is folk.
Wonderful stuff there. Fairport Convention, "Come All Ye."
I mean, that's a great name. And the early to mid-70s, really the commercial, certainly high point of British folk rock. Lindisfarne had their first hit, "Meet Me on the Corner" in 72. Straubs were interesting. Sandy Denny joined them in 67. They actually recorded some stuff that found its way in 73 as an album called "All Our Own Work." And Rick Wakeman joined the Straubs in 70, and he left in 71, so he wasn't with them too long, and replaced by Blue Weaver. And they had their first hit in the end of 1972. They only had 3 more hit singles, the last one in 1973, and Lindisfarne, 73. They split into 2 bands, sort of Lindisfarne Mark II and Jack the Lad. They had a disagreement about the direction they should be going in. Ralph Mctell, he was successful. Everybody remembers from 1974, Streets of London, end of 74. It got to number 2, but you tend to think of him as one of the most commercially successful, and he only had 1 more hit in 1975. The Incredible String Band, they folded, 74. And Jethro Tull, I mean, they had their first hit single, Love Story, reached number 29 in November 1968, and they had a run of 6 UK hit singles, and the last one of those was in 1976. Interestingly, they performed at the first ever Glastonbury Festival, but it's only actually billed as Ian Anderson. I've never been able to find a report as to whether it was Ian Anderson doing a solo flight, or whether it was the band, and he was the only one that got the credit for it. But that last single that they had a hit was actually on an EP, and it was Ring Out the Solstice Bells from 1976, and their next hit single wasn't until 1984. So you can probably see it all ties in again with punk. Punk reared its head towards the middle end
and
of
everything like that went down.
And by the end of 77, there wasn't an awful lot competing with it.
Yeah, Derek, as usual, wonderful, completely wonderful. The British folk rock scene there, and brought to you by Mr. Derek Shelmerdine. Derek will be back again after the 10 o'clock news, when we're going to do what's happened on this day over the years.
Absolutely, some great stuff.
Yeah, but taking us up to the 9 o'clock news, the aforementioned Jethro Tull, and believe it or not, even at this time of year, this is Ring Out the Solstice Bells. I'll see you after the 9 o'clock news.